So now, without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker of the day. Malcolm Barr is Head of Western European Economic Research at JP Morgan and will share his outlook for the global economy and government and central bank policy, as he addresses the question of whether the current inflationary surge will prove temporary or persistent. Malcolm joined us for Think-Tank in 2017 and outlined his view then that the next downturn would be followed by more QE and a resurgence in fiscal spending. But few, if any, would have expected either to be on the incredible scale we've seen since then. So the question is, where to from here? Over to you, Malcolm.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. And Andrew, thank you for the kind remarks of introduction. It was particularly kind of you to remember a few things I said from a few years ago that actually made a little bit of sense. I should also thank you for giving me the title of my presentation this morning. It's always good when the title of a presentation asks a question which you feel that you can answer relatively quickly. The title of my presentation today, Inflation Transitory or Persistent, and in true sort of time-honoured presentation skills fashion, they say tell your audience what you're going to tell them, and then tell them again. Well, here on slide 2, here's the overview of what we're going to discuss. Inflation, persistent or transitory? The short answer is it's both. There is a component of the recent pickup in inflation which is probably temporary. There's a component which is probably going to be with us for longer. And the real question here is what's the mix of those two? And I'm going to try and talk you through some of the issues around that in the time I've got with you. There are a lot of people that are making the argument that there is a very large persistent component to the recent pickup in inflation. I'm going to predominantly argue against that view in my remarks this morning. But we will take a look at some of the arguments for higher inflation this morning. I think we need to recognise that a move up in inflation is something that central banks globally have actually been wanting to occur. This might be a little bit of a case of be careful what you wish for, but in my mind, I think some of what is happening in the inflation dynamic is actually quite healthy and will put the global economy in a better position as we go forward. So we'll review some of those issues. And just to finish off, whenever you hear an economist talking about inflation, there should be a number lingering in the back of your mind, and that number is 30%. And that number is approximately what most empirical models of inflation can't explain, in the sense of the further forward you simulate your models, the less or the more of the inflation process you can't explain. And there's always around a third or 30% or so, which is sort of sitting there waiting to be explained. And so as an economist talking about inflation, I do think there needs to be a little bit of humility in the sense of recognizing, we can get things wrong, not just because of the things that we know are important in the inflation process that we may misjudge, but also that there is a part of the story at all times that we find rather difficult to explain. So let's get to the meat of what we need to discuss this morning. If you look at slide 3, a little bit of historical perspective in terms of what's been going on with inflation in the developed markets over the course of the post-war era, at least the period since 1970. And what you basically see is that the recent pickup in inflation to approximately a 4% year-on-year rate if you aggregate across the developed world is pretty unusual by the standards of the time series since about the early 90s. We did get one pickup in inflation just on the eve of the financial crisis that got to around this ballpark, but at the moment this is looking somewhat unusual in the time series, and one suspects at the moment that this is not the peak in terms of what you see in this chart. To move to slide 4, I don't think we can go very far in talking about inflation without having to deal with some of the underlying theory and trying to get certain preconceptions out of the way before we can address a lot of the issues. Now, I am very well aware that as the first presentation in a series of several, your stomach for economic theory may probably be a little bit limited at this stage. So I'm going to try and give you a crash course in how economists think about inflation in only a handful of slides. So here we go. Theory of Inflation 101. At the root of most classical approaches to inflation is an accounting identity, which is the equation of exchange. And I show that on slide 4, and that equation is MV equals PT. Those 4 letters have caused probably more trouble in economics than any others when you've shown them as an accounting identity. What that identity basically says is that in a money-using economy, the effective stock of money must facilitate the flow of monetary transactions. So to put that differently, the amount of money in the economy multiplied by the average speed at which money changes hands must equal the level of prices in the economy times the number of transactions. So if you have 10 transactions at a price of 5, your money stock must facilitate 50 units of transaction. And it could do that by having 10 units of money where each unit changes hands 5 times, or it could do it by having 5 units of money where each unit of money changes hands 10 times. Now, how fast money circulates, or the velocity of any given measure of money supply, is a very controversial subject among economists. It's all down to something about how much cash people want to have in their wallets, how much do they want to have in their bank accounts. It's a byproduct of a lot of portfolio choices. But if we make the assumption that velocity of circulation, or the demand for money, is determined exogenously, and we also make the assumption that the level of transactions, or the number of transactions, is determined exogenously, then you get a pretty clear linkage that M, the money supply, must drive P, the level of prices. And if there is one idea that you're always going to be coming back to in the theory of inflation, it's that it's about money. It's about too much money chasing too few goods, to use an aphorism. The problem is that the assumption that T, or the number of transactions, or the economy's output, because transactions are normally related to output, is given exogenously is very questionable. It's also pretty questionable, as I've already alluded to, about whether those portfolio choices that determine the velocity of money are stable. So this linkage between money and prices is always very, very controversial, and it's not entirely implausible to think, when we think of money as including bank accounts, that actually the price level and the number of transactions can generate money supply, rather than money supply being completely a policy determined variable. If you're a bank and there is a lot of value of transactions going on in the economy, it's probably worth your while to make more loans, and in the process of doing, banks, when they make loans, typically create money. So the causation can go from the economy to money rather than the other way around. Now, if you flick to slide 5, you'll see a chart which is showing you the US data on the growth of one measure of money supply, M1, and there are many different gradations of what we call money, and what nominal GDP growth, or the total value of nominal output, has been doing. And through the 60s until maybe the mid-70s, maybe you could argue there was a relationship there. But since then, I think it's pretty clear that this is a relationship which has been very, very unstable. And the bad news is that whatever relationship you look at, it's very difficult for you to stabilize it, to use it for prediction. Now, why have I bored you with all of that? The reason I've bored you with all of that is very simple. QE has created lots of bank reserves, which are a particular type of money. And as a result, one attitude towards the current rise in inflation is that it's basically a byproduct of all these central banks producing more and more money, or liquidity as some would call it, and that the increase in prices is an inevitable consequence of that. Now, no one wants to deny that pushing inflation up has actually been something central banks have been trying to achieve, but I think that the idea that there is a mechanical linkage that means that what central banks have been doing with QE means inflation has to be linearly higher or even have some fixed relation with what money measures have been doing is just not a proposition it's tenable to have when you actually look at the data. So if we don't think inflation is particularly driven by money supply, where does it come from? Theory of Inflation 102, if you look at slide 6, we get to the way that most economists now think about the inflation process. And at the heart of this is a simple insight, which is the following. When we're measuring inflation, we're measuring prices. And prices are set predominantly by firms setting the prices for their services or the goods that they produce. Now, when we think about that, firms don't adjust their prices every day. They make their pricing decisions over a time horizon, which is variable. The most common period is about a year, and it is costly to be changing prices any more frequently than that. And against that backdrop, something that's important in the pricing process is that firms have to have some kind of expectation as to what's going to happen with a lot of things over the year for which their prices are set. So they have to think about what their competitors will be doing, have to think about what their costs will be doing, they have to think about what wages will be doing, and they have to think about what inflation in the economy as a whole will be doing. And that is where perhaps the biggest feature of the way that modern economics thinks about inflation begins to get its traction, and that is the idea that inflation really depends on expectations. Because if firms are expecting high inflation, they will set their prices today to try and incorporate and anticipate the inflation they think will occur. And by extension, that will mean measures of inflation go up. So the first channel of thinking about inflation for modern central banks is about managing inflation expectations and trying to make sure that people in the economy as a whole believe that over time inflation will run close to central bank targets. The second influence on inflation is generically referred to as slack, or you'll sometimes hear the phrase the output gap. This is basically a measure of how far the economy as a whole is from its productive potential. To the extent that there are lots of underutilized resources lying around, for example, if firms are not using all of their capacity, then they are going to want to bring that capacity back into use. And one way to do that is to lower their prices. If their capacity is very strained, then they're probably going to be opportunistically trying to raise their profit margins. And so a measure of slack tends to give insight into the inflation process, both from the standpoint of the decisions being taken by firms, but also from the standpoint of what's going on with wages. If it's difficult to find employees, people are able to ask for higher wages, they're more likely to be granted them, and that in turn gets fed on into prices as firms set them. Finally, we're all well aware that there's a whole bunch of other things that can move prices around. This includes things like movements in the exchange rate, which push import prices up, movements in oil prices, which frankly rather drop out of the sky, movements in other import prices like food, they can be very volatile. Also things like changes in indirect taxes, they can move prices quite significantly and affect the inflation rate over short spans of time. So economists typically talk of some variant of what's called the triangle model when they're talking about inflation, and the 3 points of the triangle are typically inflation expectations, some measure of shock, and then of slack, and then some measure of other shocks to costs. When central banks are thinking about how they influence inflation, they're normally thinking about those three channels: keeping inflation expectations managed, trying to keep the economy as close as possible to its potential output. And if you're doing those two things and people can understand what you're doing, their hope is that the other stuff will be well behaved and will not give them a lot of bumps that they have to deal with. So the exchange rate will probably be floating, and you will hope it doesn't move too much, and you hope oil prices and food and energy prices won't do things that cause your inflation management lots of problems. One final thing to say here is that stable inflation expectations are a very important piece of infrastructure for central banks, not just in terms of how they think about inflation in the here and now, but also in terms about how effective their policy is. Because if, when inflation goes down, people think that low inflation is going to continue into the future, that makes any reductions in interest rates that central banks deploy at that stage less effective, because real interest rates, i.e. the nominal rate of interest minus what people think inflation is going to do over time, would find it more difficult to be reduced if inflation expectations aren't stable. So for central banks, keeping inflation expectations stable is very important, because it's, if you like, it both helps to generate the outcome that they're looking for in terms of the inflation process, and by stabilizing the inflation process, it also makes the tools that they have in order to generate what they want with inflation more effective. If you want to see the inverse of that, I'm afraid you have to look at what's going on in Japan. It's very difficult for the Bank of Japan to bring interest rates down because A, they can't reduce them very much more below zero without worrying about other implications of that. And as they have interest rates very low, people's expectations of inflation are very low. And as a result, there is a kind of uneasy situation where the Bank of Japan, almost regardless of what it does, cannot convince people to think inflation will be higher in the future, and that means its ability to deliver higher inflation is much more limited. Okay, so I hope that after that you're feeling like you're at least semi-expert in terms of the theory of inflation. So where are we? Okay. Now, we go into the current upswing, as I've already mentioned, with inflation having been troublingly low in the run-up to the pandemic. On slide 7, I've got a chart of the ECB's forecast for inflation and what actually happened. Now, I'm not just picking on the ECB here. I could have done this chart for the Federal Reserve, and it would have looked pretty similar. But the coloured lines are showing you the ECB staff forecast for inflation at various points in time, and the red line is showing you what inflation actually did. And really, since about 2013, there's been a persistent tendency for inflation to be low, for central banks to forecast that it will go back up towards their targets, and for inflation not to do it. And as a result, we have had innovations, if we go to slide 8, which have been trying to overcome a sense that inflation expectations were potentially slipping. And those innovations include things like quantitative easing. If we look at slide 8, there's just a visual to show the extent of the rise in central bank balance sheets relative to GDP. And effectively what we've seen since the financial crisis is an increase in central bank balance sheets, which is bigger than we saw relative to GDP, is bigger than what we saw through the Second World War. Not just quantitative easing, but central banks have also had to innovate in other ways. They've had to develop other means to try and convince people that they will deliver on their objectives through time. The most recent innovation in that space is the Fed with its flexible average inflation targeting, which is basically a way of saying, if we don't generate inflation at our target for a while, we will make up that ground later. And as a result, it's trying to bolster the confidence that through time, inflation will run close to the Fed's near 2% objective. That's the background, and then we get the pandemic. Slide 9 shows how the pandemic has impacted not just the level of spending when we had lockdowns. You see that very clearly in both US spending on services and goods collapsing as we were going through April of last year. But it also very much has impacted the mix of people's spending. Even as we've recovered somewhat on the other side of lockdowns, services spending has been much slower to recover than spending on goods. And the pandemic has consequently given us a big shock in terms of not just the up and down of overall spending, but the composition of spending. There's been lots of sectoral change with people wanting to work from home, consume less outside of the home, and a whole series of changes in consumption patterns that follow from that. And the bad news is that that is a change in the economy which it takes time to adapt to. You can't suddenly take airplanes and use them to produce computers. It takes time to redeploy economies of resources around the economy when those sorts of shifts of demand take place. For example, if people are deciding they no longer are going on business travel and holidays, hence we don't need the aircraft, but they're going to be working from home and consequently they need a better computer and a bigger screen. So what you see on slide 10 is the byproduct of needing to reallocate those resources, which is that if you ask companies how easy is it to get inputs at this point in time, the response they're giving you is it's very difficult to get the inputs. Now, the most obvious demonstration of this currently is in semiconductors and autos. Everybody knows that the production plans of a lot of car manufacturers, particularly those based in Germany, have been very much disturbed because cars these days are full of computer chips. And as we went into the pandemic, the car producers slashed their orders for computer chips. Then they discovered demand for cars was still pretty high. And now they've discovered that they can't get hold of the computer chips to build the cars. This is exactly the sort of dynamic that is a byproduct of such rapid sectoral shifts. When we throw on top of that we've got disruption to supply chains quite simply because ports and companies have on occasion been closed through lockdowns, etc., and the whole logistics chain of moving items via a container from A to B to C has got broken, for example, because the container wasn't in the right place to do the movement. That has meant a lot of pressure on prices because of these byproducts of the pandemic. Another source of inflation, if you look at slide 11, in the wake of the pandemic, is simply normalization after the depths of the downturn. In particular, if we look at services prices, by the time we got to March, April of this year, they had got very depressed in a lot of sectors, reflecting the excess capacity generated through lockdowns. And what we've been seeing in recent months in some sectors, airline ticket prices is just one example, but hotels, prices for restaurants, etc., these have been bouncing back as activity has been normalizing after the pandemic. And it's the combination of normalization on the services side and disturbance in terms of supply chains and energy price increases for goods producers, which we see in the current run-up in inflation data. Now, a question I'm often asked at this point is, well, if we look at the data, can we identify what bits of the inflation process have been bumped by the pandemic and which ones haven't? And can we, on that basis, try and get better visibility as to what's down to the pandemic and what's going on in an underlying sense? And my colleague Alan Monks has done some work on this front for the UK. And on slide 12, I show you a breakdown which is showing you what we would normally call core inflation, which is inflation ex food and energy. We've already got rid of something of the order of 15 to 20% of the basket to get rid of those two volatile items. And then it compares that with a measure of inflation, which is excluding potentially COVID impacted sectors. And if you look at that, which is the blue line on slide 11, you get a sense that that measure of core inflation is still within its historical range. It's moved up from low levels in early 2021, but it's not that striking and it doesn't look too scary. The problem is that by the time we're looking at this measure of inflation, we're down to only 30% of the CPI basket. And if I tell you that, well, 30% of the story looks okay, by implication, 70% of the story potentially doesn't. And that's the problem. The impact of the pandemic is sufficiently pervasive that I think we've got to recognise that there could be things going on which we're attributing to that influence, which we might legitimately think would fade over time, but where we're basically making an error, and actually they may be reflective of other forces which are going to stay around for longer. Now, if we have this problem of chiseling out within the inflation data what we really think is down to the pandemic versus that which isn't, how can we get a sense of what inflation is going to do through time? Well, back to our theory 102, a first place for economists to look is in measures of inflation expectations. If we look at survey measures for the US, we can see very clearly that households are expecting inflation to be high for the next year. But if you ask them, where do you think inflation is going to be in the longer run, say 5 to 10 years from now, their responses have gone up, but not shockingly so. They're still in that sort of high 2s, close to 3 range, where they've been for most of the period since 2012 or so, when these surveys started to be collected. Similarly, if you look at what markets are pricing, slide 14 shows you five-year inflation swaps, a measure in the US and the Euro area of where markets think inflation rates are going to be. And again, we get the same message, which is that inflation has picked up from its lows, but it's still within the range that has been seen over history. So another place to look for signs of underlying inflation pressure is what we see in terms of wage growth. And here again, the information is somewhat comforting. If we look in Germany, actually the recent negotiated pay deals, and in particular there was an IG Metall deal earlier this year, those have been coming in sort of near 2 in effective terms, and there's no clear sense of a shift upward in the face of recent pandemic shocks. Now, I know that at the level of anecdote, we can all read in the newspapers lots of reports of businesses that are finding it difficult to find labour, and that they say they've had to raise wage rates in order to get workers. But if we look in the core of the labour market, we don't really see a lot of evidence of that. And as a result, again, I think the message that sends in terms of what wage growth or where the inflation process is going as the pandemic fades is relatively comforting. So to give you some numbers at JP Morgan, slide 16 just shows you the numbers that we're forecasting for inflation in terms of this year going into next. And the basic story is of a peak towards the end of this year in year-on-year terms, with core inflation in the US at somewhere close to 4.5%. A number in the UK which is more like 3%, a number in the Euro area slightly above 2%. Now, those by historical standards are very high forecasts for core inflation. If you think food and energy prices are going to basically be stable from where they are now, your headline inflation rates will actually be slightly higher than this. So there is a decent way to go in terms of getting through this process of pandemic-related shocks in the inflation data. But if you look at what we're forecasting for the end of next year, you've already made very significant progress back towards where you were in terms of inflation rates as the impacts from the pandemic fade. with US core inflation only slightly above 2 by then. The same true for the UK and the Euro area with its core inflation rate back to slightly above 1. Now I have to go through the qualifications to all of this, and particularly in the light of my comments about being somewhat humble. The first is that as far as what is going on with slack in the global economy is concerned, there is enormous uncertainty about where the pandemic will leave us in that regard. Slide 17 shows our forecasts for the path of the unemployment rate, and it looks as if after an incredible spike higher, we are going to see the unemployment rate moving back to the environs of its pre-pandemic level pretty rapidly. In fact, by the end of this year, we think we're going to be more or less in the neighborhood of where we were when the pandemic began. And I think as we look forward, it's perfectly reasonable to say, actually, by the time we've had some people leave the labour market because they decide after the pandemic that they'd rather not work, if we take into account some other changes in terms of people's willingness to work and the pay rates at which they will work, is it the case we're actually going to find that the balance of power has very much shifted from firms back to employees, and are we going to catalyse stronger wage growth as we go through time? Now, it's certainly possible, and to some extent, I would say that that's actually desirable, because we have gone through a period in which corporate profit margins globally have tended to be wide, and there has been obvious concern about inequality and the difficulties of the young in terms of accessing good jobs and good employment. And I think that some shift in the balance of power as a byproduct of the pandemic in that regard is not entirely a bad thing. And it may be the case that that actually doesn't show up very much in inflation. It shows up predominantly in terms of some pressure on corporate profits. Another source of uncertainty here is about the whole process of globalization. Slide 18 is giving you a window on this process which you may not have thought about until now. One of the things you often read here is people stating that globalization has been a downward force on inflation, and that the reversal of globalization, as supply chains get constrained and get smaller, firms look to have more control over their inputs, as we worry about global trade given the interventions of someone like Mr. Trump. I think that there is a sense in which people think this can be something which begins to push inflation up. The point I would make is you don't actually need globalization in those processes to reverse for it to start to become less of a drag on your inflation rate. And the data for the UK, which I show on slide 18, give a demonstration of that. If you look at the prices of services, these have kept rising pretty linearly over the last generation. But the prices of core goods have been remarkably stable. And it's difficult to make sense of that because a lot of the inputs into goods prices have been going up. So it's tough to know why that price level should have been so stable. And there's no doubt that one of the things which has been holding goods prices down has been the relocation of sources of supply out of the UK in this instance to cheaper sources of supply. And that brings the prices of goods down. If the shirt which I'm currently wearing is produced in China as opposed to being produced by a company in Sunderland, when I buy that shirt from Marks and Spencer's, it's likely that its price will have fallen because it's come from a cheaper supplier. And that's what we see in the inflation data over a long period of time. The issue here, however, is that at some point all of your shirts are coming from China. There isn't any production based in Sunderland anymore. And you can no longer keep those prices down simply by shifting the source of production to that cheaper location. And I do think that when we're thinking about these impacts of globalization, it isn't the case you necessarily need to reverse globalization for it to start to be less of a drag of an inflation. It's simply the case that there was only a certain amount of gains to be had in pulling inflation down, and all that low-hanging fruit has already been picked. So I think that this is another reason to think, yes, under the surface, there is probably some firming in terms of global goods pricing that we should be expecting, even if we don't think that the pandemic is going to generate a lot of change in terms of the way that supply chains, etc., are organized in the long term. This is my final set of observations now, which is really about some of the observations that people make about central banks. And I think it's fair to say that the whole set of arrangements around central banks are a lot more fluid than they've been for a very long time. And as a result, there's room for lots of opinions about what will happen in the future. And it's fair to say that as central banks have been doing QE, that they've got more experimental in terms of what they've been doing, and that they are more in the fiscal space than they've been for a long time. And that can create a lot of issues in terms of where the boundary is between what fiscal policy is doing and what the central bank is doing. And a lot of people think that means that effectively central banks are either going to be lent on by politicians, or they're going to voluntarily start doing things that de-emphasize their inflation objectives. I would say, by and large, yes, that's something that we can worry about, but actually central banks have had enough of a job worrying about their own knitting rather than worrying about extensions of their influence. A lot of what we've been seeing with QE, for example, is basically a response to the constraints on interest rate policy and trying to get inflation in line with their targets through time. So I don't see too much mission creep in terms of what central banks are doing. And I think that their main focus is still going to be delivering on the mandates that they've already been set. As far as those mandates are concerned, there is an issue that some people think, look, politicians are just going to redefine the targets or lean on central banks to just interpret them differently. And all I would say there is that actually the inflation targeting framework has proven pretty durable through a number of shocks. And as much as it gets a lot of criticisms, we don't really have too many working examples of how you can replace it that actually have demonstrated any success. And so I think it's very difficult for critics to articulate exactly what the alternative is. And in the meantime, markets and society in general have generally been relatively comfortable with the division of labour that we've had between central banks and politicians. Finally, just in terms of where are the boundaries between what central banks do and what politicians do, obviously QE has raised a lot of issues, and we can all speculate about where that goes in future. But I would just point out one thing. There are academic measures of central bank independence which have got a lot of failings, and they're very mechanical, but they try to quantify things like how much control do central banks have over their mandates, how easy is it for politicians to change the personnel at the central bank. And those measures have basically not changed through either the global financial crisis or through the pandemic. So to my mind, I think the record so far speaks to the longevity of independent central banks targeting inflation as their main objective, rather than suggesting this is something that's going to change at all rapidly. So where does this leave us all? Just to summarise, we think that most of the pickup in inflation that we've seen is going to be transitory. We think there is a piece of the pickup in inflation which is sought by central banks and in some senses is healthy. So it's very likely that the decades to come is not going to see the ongoing undershoot of inflation targets that had become the norm in the decade prior to the pandemic. But it's also not clear to us that we should regard that as anything other than something which is healthy for the global economy as opposed to being a challenge. Final observation, all of that is very well and good, but when it comes to inflation, we have to be humble and we have to recognize we can certainly get this wrong, and we'll certainly have plenty more to talk about it as we go through time.